The last time I spoke to this audience was at Houston, so I guess that's so long ago that you forgot what I said, which is probably a good thing. But I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to once again talk to you. Well, as you can see from the subject, I've been given a very broad and very blank canvas on which to sketch some thoughts about the future of the international shipping industry. It's a monumental task, with little probability that any of my predictions will come to pass. Or will they? Only time will tell. I'm going to start with some macroeconomic thoughts, and don't let that turn you off too much because it'll be quite short, but they're purely from the ship owner's perspective, before I dip into the shipping industry itself, and then its relationship with the ports of the world, and what we talk about, of course, is the ship-port interface. So, a wise man said that prediction is great until you talk about the future. But perhaps Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said the best way to predict the future is to create it. Now, I know that our keynote speaker this morning attributed this saying to somebody else, but I can assure you Abraham Lincoln got there first. So, somewhere between these two extremes, denial and creativity, is there a middle ground that is more precisely matched to the needs of the shipping industry and to its related stakeholders such as you, the ports industry? Shipping is often characterized by a reluctance to depart from its traditions. There are notable exceptions, but often we see a competition to be second in the innovation race. Being first to innovate implies risk, cost, and uncertainty of returns. The desire for prudence is understandable when ordering multi-million-dollar assets with a lead time from drawing board to operation of more than 3 years, and with the expectation that the useful trading life of a ship should extend 25 years or more. But the pace of change is accelerating in the world around us, and we can already see signs that shipping is evolving more rapidly than ever before. We face a world that will be significantly different in 20 years' time. I'm not an economist, but some evolutionary changes are self-evident, and the following thoughts on global economic trends are distilled from some work that was undertaken by The Economist magazine's intelligence unit and then presented to ICS very recently. Taken as a whole, the world is still trying to climb out of the 2008 downturn, and the rate of this recovery has implications for global trade, as does the shifting platform of differentials between countries and sectors. It seems that emerging markets will be increasingly diversified, causing shifts in the economic balance. Trade in energy is already changing, and manufacturing centers are likely to diversify. However, there are lots of uncertainties. Will there be a win-win global common scenario under the umbrella of a global free trade agreement? Or will the world revert to protectionism in the event of some future economic shock that we cannot even anticipate? And what will be the cost of energy? Has the dramatic fall in oil price stabilized? And will developments such as the shale revolution lead to cheap energy? Or will energy become increasingly more expensive, inhibiting economic growth and forcing change? We live in a world of much increased economic uncertainty, not least in the Middle East, in Russia, and in the South China Sea. The ranking of GDP by 2035 is likely to see China at the top, followed by the United States, India, Japan, Indonesia, and Mexico. However, much of the GDP growth in emerging economies will be in the service sectors, as they become similar in character to the current OECD economies. So not all of this growth will necessarily drive increased demand for maritime transport. In the early 2000s, a 1% growth in GDP translated into a 3% increase in demand for container shipping. Today, this differential is less than 2, and it is expected to decline further. This is really important because estimates of future growth in maritime trade, which are based on past experience, may result with significant overestimates based on past experience. Just one example of where this overestimation may be particularly serious is with estimates for CO2 growth with shipping. According to the latest IMO greenhouse gas study, these emissions may increase by up to 200% by 2050. In the light of the economic change I've just described, this may be a gross overestimation. Supply chains are expected to become more complicated, but they will also shorten, as export economies such as China source their components much more locally. The economists of OECD place more emphasis today on the importance of value added in the economic process. As an example of what is meant by this, I use the retail price of an Apple product. If you measure what it costs to manufacture it, it's just a few dollars, and then think about what is its actual price in the marketplace. This metric is in contrast to the balance of payments derived from comparing exports and imports. Unnoticed by many, China's overall population growth has started to stabilize, but major shifts towards Chinese population centers mean that growth in urban population levels will continue, thus creating new consumer markets for food and household goods. In Africa, on the other hand, population will continue to grow, reaching 1.4 billion, or 18% of the global total, by 2025. Trade patterns are changing. By 2030, some predict that the top 10 exporters of goods and services will be China, US, India, Germany, Japan, Hong Kong, Netherlands, France, South Korea, and UK. That is a significant switch of positions from today. China's position as a labor supply country is not thought to be under threat, although there will be significant wage increases in China, and this will serve to increase the attractiveness of labor from India, the Philippines, Peru, Mexico, Eastern Europe, and Vietnam, amongst others. Companies looking at emerging trade opportunities will make their own analysis of risk in terms of operations, local infrastructure, and political stability. Trade across the Atlantic is falling relative to Pacific trade. Pacific trade is 53% of world trade against only 46% in the Atlantic. There is a definite shift to the Pacific Rim that is obvious today, but which has actually been underway for at least 60 years. The imbalance in trade continues. In OECD countries, 1.3 billion people import around 5 tons per head. The equivalent for non-OECD countries is 6 billion people, with an import equivalent of less than 1 ton. The center of gravity is visibly moving to Asia, and it is inevitable that in a globalized world, trading imbalances will be addressed and that the pendulum will probably slowly swing in the opposite direction. Let me now introduce some ideas about the shipping industry itself. I said earlier that the industry was slow to innovate and that there were exceptions. It is these very exceptions that have done so much to change the visible face of the industry. Ships have got bigger, changed their means of propulsion several times, and become specialized cargo carriers in rather less than 150 years. The last century saw astonishing structural changes in the carriage of cargo by sea. Such changes have in turn driven infrastructure changes in ports and in the port hinterland. Deeper berths and bigger cranes are but the most obvious signs. But distribution networks have to keep up with the demand for rapid turnaround and even greater supply chain efficiency. The avoidance of peak congestion times in cargo distribution systems ashore must be a part of your agenda. Partly driven by regulation and partly by commercial pressure, individual ship efficiency has shown an exponential increase over the last 60 years when measured by ton of cargo carried against fuel burned. Despite recent regulatory measures on new ships to drive efficiency even more rigorously in pursuit of global climate change targets, the wise money must expect further measures to regulate yet further the efficiency of the existing fleet. These measures are likely to be economic in nature, and it will be equally wise to expect these measures to continue to apply even to new ships built with the ever-decreasing EEDI values. We should seriously question the trajectory of fuel consumption and efficiency of maritime transport. What are the sources of future economies? Can ships get bigger, carry more cargo, turn around more quickly, and yet maintain the same trajectory for safety and provide a rewarding career with retention as a key performance standard? One of the areas that we should jointly explore is the matter of efficiency across the complete maritime transport chain. This is about reducing waiting times for ships, so-called just-in-time arrival, as well as expeditious but safe cargo handling and efficiency of road and rail infrastructure in the hinterland. This question brings me to the consideration of technology and the possible impacts of interesting new developments on so-called unmanned ships. I know that at least one limited voyage has been undertaken by an unmanned prototype. I do not personally believe that we will ever move to a world where all ocean-going ships are unmanned, but I can see an evolution towards unmanned or minimally manned ships on local voyages. But the biggest impact of development in automation is likely to see ship systems increasingly operated without human intervention. In deep ocean, I have no doubt that ships can be made to operate autonomously. Navigation and collision avoidance problems are generally straightforward. But how will these ships be navigated in poor weather, when so often ship safety and prudence are communicated through the soles of the watchkeeper's feet, leading to speed and course changes to ease the pressure on the ship's structure? I have asked the proponents of unmanned ships to discuss bringing such ships into piloted waters, and all of them agree that a pilotage team will be required to be transferred on board. In bad weather, how will the ship be safely held off the coast if the pilotage team cannot be brought on board due to the conditions? Crews already complain about the problems of lean manning, isolation and loneliness on board with next to no social activity. When the machine does virtually everything, what will keep the crew occupied? What will be the job satisfaction? In parallel with the growth of interest in automation, there is an increase in warnings of the dangers of cyber attack. Are unmanned or lean manned ships more or less likely to be made rogue by some form of cyber-based takeover? There are some very interesting infrastructure developments already underway whose global significance may not have been completely assessed. The commissioning of the new locks in the Panama Canal in 2016 has been well advertised, and the new approach to toll setting has been subject to public consultation and adoption. Opportunities for larger ships to make the transit have been driving some ports in the US to get ready for larger, deeper draft ships. Perhaps less well advertised, but already very well underway, is the scheme in Egypt to cut a waterway parallel to the existing Suez Canal for a significant part of its length. This will significantly improve the waiting time before making the canal transit and increasing the capacity of the canal in terms of daily throughput. It will also improve the resilience of the canal infrastructure in the event of a ship breakdown. There is also talk of a new canal through Nicaragua, financed by a Chinese entrepreneur, and allegedly earth has been cut, although this seems to have more to do with port development than the first few meters of a new canal. However, this is an interesting prospect that could conceivably create toll competition with Panama. The third route opening up at present is the long-fabled Northern Sea route. There is significant interest with respect to the possibilities for trade between Japan, Korea, Northeast China, and Northwest Europe. The route provides a fuel saving of around 30% over the traditional route via Suez, although this is offset to some extent by the cost of paying for the mandatory Russian nuclear icebreaker escort. Whilst the route is not yet ice-free continuously, and in fact there was more ice in 2014 than in 2013, year on year Russian authorities expect to issue an increasing number of licenses. 600 were issued in 2014, but there were less than 70 complete transits. Much of this traffic is destination traffic in support of exploration and exploitation in the Arctic region, but there does seem to be a steady increase in through traffic. However, even if use of the Northern Sea Route increases 5 times to, say, 350 transits a year, this has to be put into the context of 20,000 Suez transits every year. The opening up of larger ships in Panama and Suez is going to have a profound effect on the efficiency of maritime transport and on world trade. It has become a mantra for ICS in support of its members that the global shipping industry can only operate within a framework of global rules. And by extension, this implies that national and regional rules developed outside of the global framework proposed by IMO or that extend beyond the IMO rules are frankly an anathema to the shipping industry. And this brings me to certain aspects of recent environmental regulation, and I want to mention just two: the Ballast Water Convention and MARPOL Annex 6 on air pollution. The amendment to our MARPOL Annex 6 on the sulfur content of fuel was a rather elegant way of reflecting regional concerns on local air quality within an international framework. While setting a global cap on the amount of sulfur permitted in bunker fuel, it also created the concept of emission control areas, or ECAs, to address local air quality concerns. And this was driven in the debating stage by Northwest European states bordering the Baltic Sea. As you know, states are permitted to request the establishment of an ECA to protect regional vulnerability, but must apply the international sulfur limit within that area, in this case 0.1% sulfur. So far, so good. But the global cap regulation includes, at the request of ICS, a requirement to complete a study in 2018 to assure the IMO that there is actually adequate low sulfur fuel available for the global fleet. If the IMO is satisfied, then the global cap of 0.5% sulfur will become effective on the 1st of January 2020. Legally, it is not absolutely clear what happens if adequate fuel is not available. But the regulation includes a provision to delay entry into force until 2025, but no later. However, Europe in its wisdom has created a regulation that was for the most part following MARPOL, sets a hard line of 2020 for the global cap in European waters, regardless of what the IMO decides. This is an example of a group of states following international regulation, but preempting any possibility that the industry could be assisted by a delayed entry into force, regardless of whether there is compliant fuel available. The Ballast Water Convention is a dramatic example of an aspirational requirement for ships to fit equipment that was certainly not available when the convention was adopted back in 2004, and whose availability to meet the compliance criteria even today, 11 years after adoption, is frankly highly questionable. But regardless of the highly influential role played by the US in shaping the convention, and the truism that the US is unlikely ever to ratify the convention, the USA has pressed ahead with national regulation that is already creating an impossible situation for ship owners. If the convention achieves its ratification criteria soon, which is fairly likely, then ships will be required to fit treatment equipment type approved under the IMO regime. Such equipment may very well not be compliant with the US type approval for ships operating in US waters. This treatment equipment costs up to $5 million per ship, and the US may gracefully offer a dispensation of only 5 years to operate in US waters before the same ship must have another $5 million spent in order to obtain US type approved equipment. There is no US type approved equipment on the market at the moment. This is an example of complete disregard for the level playing field of international regulation. The US reservation at IMO on the Ballast Water Convention just a couple of weeks ago has really emphasized the impact that unilateral regulation has on an industry that can only work efficiently under international regulation. The current situation created by the US is only serving to delay the installation of ballast water equipment, which is in the interest of nobody. I could go on about flaws in the international process, but I will just hint at one other problem. This is that at the very time when the industry is under regulatory pressure to create ever more efficient ships, it is hit with the requirement to fit ballast water treatment equipment. And as an alternative to low sulfur fuel, probably exhaust gas scrubbing equipment, all of which create entirely new demands for increased fuel consumption, with ships becoming floating industrial plants. This is an example of tension between regulations with differing objectives, each inhibiting the aim of the other. Mention of efficiency and fuel consumption leads me on to climate change. I'm sure that you are all well aware of measures, both existing and mooted, to regulate for ships that are more efficient. We hear a lot of inaccurate reporting of how inefficient maritime transport is and how its contribution to climate change will increase exponentially in future years. ICS believes that the trajectory of efficiencies already imposed through regulation and through commercial pressure will do much to address those concerns without the need for further market-based measures. It seems that the objective of discussion on market-based measures is not about efficiency at all, but it's on finding cash cows for UNFCCC funds for adaptation and mitigation in the developing world. Little attention has been paid to the indication in the IMO greenhouse gas study that shipping CO2 emissions actually reduced around 10% between 2007 and 2012. It seems counterintuitive to use the shipping industry, the engine of globalization, to fund the developing world's climate change mitigation activity, which can only have the effect of increasing the cost of maritime transport, ultimately to the disadvantage of the developing world. With all the focus on the impact of shipping on climate change, there has been remarkably little thought given to the impact of climate change on shipping and its supporting infrastructure. Whatever our beliefs in cause, most people understand that the effect of climate change is increasingly dramatic weather events and an inexorable rise in sea level. This clearly means that port facilities and port infrastructure need to take account of a sea level that might be a metre or two higher by the end of this century. Many coastal states are reluctant to fulfill their hydrographic surveying and chart production obligations already, but they need to be made aware that port entry surveys are going to become increasingly important as sea level rises. If the incidence and ferocity of storms is increasing, then how long do we have before we need to look at ship design from the perspective of hull strength and create new structural requirements in SOLAS? The IMO has in any case mooted a revision of SOLAS, which will occupy the next 20 years. I'd like to now turn finally attention to the ship-port interface. Over the years, ICS and IAPH have developed a very good working relationship and have collaborated on issues of common interest at IMO in particular. I would very much like to see that collaboration grow yet more. There is considerable mutual benefit to be gained. We in ICS do have concerns about port facilities that you should be aware of. The timely provision of waste reception facilities is a perennial issue. We're certainly interested in following up on facilities that fall short of international obligation. I mentioned MARPOL Annex 6 a few moments ago, and you will be aware that an alternative means of compliance to low sulfur is the use of an exhaust gas scrubber. But we are receiving reports that early users of open loop scrubbers are being refused entry to some ports and are having to switch to low sulfur fuel immediately before entry, negating the installation of the scrubber and increasing the risk of breakdown in the port entrance. Users of closed loop systems are finding difficulty landing the waste sludge, another example of a lack of waste reception facilities. On a much more positive note, there is great interest in the provision of Wi-Fi facilities in terminals so that ship's crew can get internet access from the ship. If this is not already an IAPH membership policy, then I would encourage that you give it very serious consideration. Also on the subject of crew welfare, we still get informed of instances where access ashore through terminals is difficult and seafarers are constrained to remaining on board the ship. This is not helping us to retain seafarers in the profession, and more thought needs to be given to the sustainability of a career at sea and the role that port facilities have in that objective. So, ladies and gentlemen, how can I bring all these threads together into some form of conclusion on predicting the next 20 years? Is it denial or is it creativity? To be realistic, there are some issues that are within the control of the industry. Matching ship design to expected demands on efficiency, low-cost maritime transport, and emerging trade routes, and embracing innovation certainly are in the creative, controllable category. We would like to join with you in the port industry in discussion on overall supply chain efficiency. We should be open to automation, but cautious when debating the possibility of unmanned operation. Your views on this would be welcome. The need to create a sustainable career path and to move working conditions forward under the umbrella of the Maritime Labour Convention is within our control. But Wi-Fi seems to be as essential as food, water and oxygen to today's young seafarers, and we must jointly do all we can to promote its availability. You might think that managing the cargo capacity of the world fleet is within our control, but any measures that ship owners take are contradicted by the regulatory pressure for newer, more efficient ships, which leads to shortened ship life expectancy, pressure on recycling capacity, and downward pressure on scrap prices. The type of fuel that will be in common usage in 2035 is likely still to be fossil fuel, but with increased use of LNG as an interim solution. What fuel may be in use in the second half of this century is probably beyond our imagination. The recent fall in fuel price shows just how unpredictable the oil market can be. I'm sure that IAPH has noticed that the regulatory process at IMO needs a serious overhaul and needs shifting to take much greater account of the impact on the industry and on world trade. Unexpected consequences of regulation must be avoided. We can control this process if we get a common industry determination, including all of the industry stakeholders, including the ports at the IMO. It needs to be done quickly to get it into place as the Ballast Water Convention, air emission regulation, and climate change considerations really start to bite. We live in a world of rapidly changing economic and political dynamics, where risk and uncertainty are characteristics. But unlike many industries, we can jointly depend upon trade growth and demand for capacity in maritime transport. It is our belief in this that will determine the future shape of both of our industries. I therefore propose creativity and not denial. Thank you very much.